Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at Winelect, and today we're going to be looking at Azure Service Operators with Kubernetes and how you can use these to use Kubernetes to orchestrate resources on Azure. Hello world, staying safe with my official Winelect antivirus here. I'm going to take it off since I'm at home now. I'm not out and about, so I'm not going to be getting COVID-19. But we protect ourselves when we're in public by wearing masks, and we protect our computers by using antivirus, and we protect resources on Azure by using security. So keep yourself safe out there and keep your stuff safe on Azure as well. But today we're going to be talking about something that's a new cool feature that you can use with Kubernetes. I've been doing a long series on Kubernetes, particularly Azure Kubernetes services, where I've been talking about a lot of things that you can do with Azure Kubernetes services. And this one was announced yesterday. I was planning on doing a completely different video this week, but I thought this technology was too cool to pass up to not do a video on. So I'm going to dedicate this video to this new technology that was announced yesterday by the Kubernetes team at Microsoft. So the new technology that was announced was something called Azure Service Operators. Now, these are a way of using Kubernetes to do orchestration on Azure. So typically we do orchestration on Azure with tools like ARM templates or the Azure CLI or PowerShell. And these tools will call out to the APIs on Azure Resource Manager and deploy resources like storage accounts or virtual machines or database type things that are used by applications on Azure. Now, what service operators do is take that same idea and bring it under the umbrella of Kubernetes. So with a service operator, what you can do is create resources using Kubernetes on Azure. So right in line with your application, you can create a pod, you can create a deployment, you can create a load balancer, an ingress, all of that stuff using Azure Kubernetes manifest files, or you can use Helm charts. And at the same time, if you want to use Azure resources for other things on those applications, you can use service operators in conjunction with those other resources that you're deploying to Kubernetes. So this allows you to use a single manifest file or Helm chart to automate the deployment of an entire application while creating the resources on Kubernetes as well as on Azure. So this is a really kind of a cool approach to building out DevOps pipelines on Azure without having to have a two-step process for both deploying the Azure resources as well as the Kubernetes resources. You can do it all with Azure Kubernetes services using these service operators. Now, again, these things are kind of in their early stages, but if the idea catches on, I could really see it having a lot of benefit for folks that are using Azure Kubernetes services. So I'm not going to recommend them as a first-class service on Azure yet, because they're still a little rough around the edges. But as some of these bugs get worked out, I think these could really become a cool way to do DevOps using Kubernetes as well as Azure in the future. So I'm here inside of a PowerShell terminal here, and I'm going to run some commands against this PowerShell terminal to set up Azure Service Operators. Now, this is not exactly a trivial setup because there's a lot of things that you have to do to make it work. And the first thing that you need to do is create a couple of Kubernetes resources for certificate management. And this is really just a certificate manager because this is used by the actual service operators whenever they're interacting with Azure. So these commands simply just run those commands against the Kubernetes cluster, and then it will actually create the resources on there for you. I didn't grab enough for my copy and paste there. And so that's going to create some of these certificate managers. Now I'm going to link instructions on how to do this in the description below. These are from GitHub. I've modified them a little bit for PowerShell because they were written for Bash scripting or for Linux hosts. I adapted them for PowerShell here. So once I have the server certificate manager installed, I can install a webhook for that, and then I can then do some other things to make this actually available to me. And once that becomes available, I will set up the actual service operator controller that is going to be installed into Kubernetes. Okay, now that the certificate manager webhook is installed, I can now install the actual Azure Service Operators into Kubernetes using a Helm chart. Now, Helm is a package manager for Kubernetes. I don't think I've talked about it, but if you've been around Kubernetes for any amount of time, you probably have used Helm at some point. It's very easy to install. I'll link a link to how to install it in the description of this video below, but you can install it pretty easily. And once you have it installed, you can do the installation of Azure Service Operators from the Helm chart. So to set this up, I'm going to set the Helm experimental OCI to 1. This is an environment variable, so this would depend on which shell you're using, but this is how you set it inside of PowerShell. And once you have that, then you can download the Helm chart to the local repository for Helm, and then you can export the chart to a local directory here. And now I should have that Azure Service Operator directory right here, which has the final Helm charts and also the README files for it as well. This is what I'm going to actually use to deploy Azure Service Operators. I don't need to go into the nitty-gritty details of what's contained within that, but basically it's just all of the necessary Kubernetes manifest files that are parameterized in such a way that will create those resources in Kubernetes for me. And there's quite a bit of things it does create. So when I run my next command, you will see it. But before I do that, let's go over to Azure and actually create something there. So I want to create a service principal in Azure. And to do a service principal in Azure, you use Azure Active Directory. And Azure Active Directory is, as you know, the one-stop shop for all access and identity management on Azure. So to create a service principal on Azure Active Directory, you go to app registrations. Now you can use an existing one, or you can create a new one by simply going to new registration. You type in a ASO demo, whatever you want to call it, and then you would tell it, is it a redirect URI? You want to use a single tenant or multi-tenant, whichever one you are trying to do here. For this one, I'm using a single tenant, and for the one I've already created, I'm going to use a single tenant. You'd simply go to do a redirect to localhost, because that's really not even relevant. You click register, and it'll register that application. Once it's registered, though, it's going to show up inside of your owned applications here, and then you can come into this guy and you can look at the various parameters that you're going to have here. Now for ours, we're going to need a couple of things from this screen here. We're going to need the tenant ID or the directory ID, and we're going to copy and paste that. The actual application or client ID, as it's sometimes called, we're going to copy that. And then we're going to get the actual certificate and secret right here, and we're going to create a new secret here. And you would create that some name for it, ASO demo, and you would give it an expiration. And once you click create, it's going to display a value right here that you can copy and paste. So to recap, we need a secret. It can be any kind of secret that's created here, and we need the client ID and the tenant ID from this particular service principal. Once you have those pieces of information, copy and paste those into a text editor, and you will have those available for you. Now, once you have the service principal created, we need to go into our subscriptions and assign that service principal to whatever subscription that we're going to be using to create our Kubernetes cluster, as well as all the other resources that we're going to be using. And to do that, you can come into your subscription managements here, and then go to access controls, and you can assign a role here by selecting on add role, and you can select contributor, which should be sufficient for this. It doesn't need to be owner. And then you can select it to group Azure Service Principal here, or use a user managed identity. We're using a service principal, and then you would select in what's the name of it. So you type in ASO demo, and I could select those there. And I've already done this, so I'm just going to show you the role assignments here. I actually had two of them named that for some reason, so I added both of them as a contributor at this particular Visual Studio Enterprise subscription that I have here. And once I've added that service principal as a contributor at this particular subscription, it should be able to create resources for me inside of my subscription. So I'll need to be able to grab the subscription ID that I'm going to be using for my Azure Service Operators to create stuff on Azure using Kubernetes. So I'm going to grab this right here, copy, and then I'm going to paste that into the place that I have all of those other credentials that I copied from my service principal. So once I have all of those, I can then create a new, I can create the actual service principal here, and we'll be using that as a reference inside of my commands here. and I'm going to show you where you can create this command and where you can get this command from. This command is linked in the description below, but what you will want to do is paste in the relevant pieces of information from the subscription as well as from the service principal that we just created. That would be the subscription ID right here. This is the tenant ID. That is the directory ID for your Azure Active Directory that you created the particular subscription in, and the one that is tied to whatever resources that you're going to be creating as well. This is the client ID or the app that you created when you created the service principal, and then you will need the secret that you created. And I'm showing mine here. This won't be available, so I'm going to delete this service principal as soon as I publish this video. But those 4 pieces of information I need to plug into this command right here to actually run the creation of this on Azure. So once I have those pieces of information, I can then take this Helm command here and I can take it down into my PowerShell session where I've created everything, and I'm going to paste it in there. And this, if all goes well, will create my instance of Azure Service Operators inside of my Kubernetes cluster. And this will take a few minutes to create, so I'll come back when it's done. Okay, it looks like it deployed all right. I have my status deployed right here, and then I did a kubectl get pods on the namespace Azure Operators -system, and that will tell me what pods were created. And I currently have two of those containers up and running in that particular set of pods. So I know that things are running now. I can actually now use this to create resources on Azure. So let's switch over to my manifest file that I have created. And I want to walk through this to show you the resources I'm going to be creating with Azure, Azure Service Operators on Azure, not the actual Kubernetes resources, because these are different. And so what I have here is a manifest file that I'm using to install WordPress. Now, this one is going to be using the particular Azure Service Operators for MySQL, because that's what WordPress uses for database. So to create this, there's a couple of these that I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using one called MySQL server, and another one called MySQL database, and another one called MySQL firewall rule. And these are all the service operators that I need to create this successfully. So to set this up, I need to give it a name. So I need to make sure that all these parameters match my actual resource group that I have created already. So I can come back over here and let's make sure that those match up. Since I created a new cluster here for this particular demo when I was preparing for this, I created a new one just to run those commands. So I'm going to use that one as my resource group here. So let's flip back over and make sure that my resource group, do a universal replace on this to make sure that this is all good. And I'm going to change the name of my server since I already created a server called Blaze Server. And I'm going to change a few parameters here inside of my server parameters here. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm setting up a SQL server based on the parameters that I need to set that up for Azure. So this is going to be the name of my server. This is going to be my location or region for Azure. This is the resource group, and these are the versions. SSL enforcement, I've disabled that. In a production environment, I would want to enable that, but to make WordPress work with this, I needed to disable that enforcement. I'm going to use the default mode. Now I'm going to use a very basic database here. The B is for basic Gen 5 hardware and 1 core. So that's pretty much the bare minimum database you can have for MySQL on Azure. And then this sets the size of it, so it's 512 megabytes. This is the generation of hardware and the 1 CPU. So that is the specifications I need to create a database. And that's the database server. So on that database server, I'm going to create a database, and that's pretty much all I need to do for this is just give it a name. So in this case, WP database, WordPress database. And I need to tell it which resource group and the server that I'm using as well. And then from there, I need to create some firewall rules against that to allow traffic to come into that. And I'm just going to open it wide open. In a production environment, I probably wouldn't do this, but I'm just using MySQL firewall rule. I need to give it the resource group and the server name so it'll know where to create that firewall rule. So you can see this looks just like any other resource I create on Kubernetes in a manifest file. I tell it the API version, I tell it the kind, and then I give it the parameters that I need to create it. And everything else is pretty much looks like a standard deployment for this. Now, this particular Azure Service Operator, though, will create a secrets for me on Azure. So a secret that it creates, or when I create this database, it's going to generate a user for me as well as a password, and it's going to put in the host name for that particular database server into a secrets for me so that I can access that secrets in my application. So to do that, I can come down here and look at the secrets down here that is created for my WordPress application. So this one has Blaze Server. I'm going to set those a Blaze Server 1 because what it's actually going to do is create a Kubernetes secret with the same name as the database server that I created. And so in this case, the secret is going to be Blaze Server 1. And now I'm just basically plugging in the values from those keys in my Kubernetes secret into the environment variables for WordPress, and these are going to be injected into that pod and therefore the container at these appropriate places so that WordPress will be configured to use that database and that database host. So I need to tell it what database host, and that's coming from this one. I need to tell it what database user, and that's coming from this one right here. Inside of my fully qualified username, and there's the database name, which I hard coded because that's being created by a different service operator, and the database password right here, which is coming from the key password. So with those, I can generate the database and then populate these secrets from that database as well. So this otherwise is basically a standard WordPress installation using Kubernetes. There's my persistent volume claim, there's my load balancer, and everything else above that is related to my SQL that I'm using on Azure. So a single manifest file that I'm going to be using to create a WordPress installation on Kubernetes, but it's also going to create the MySQL database for this WordPress installation on Azure. So let's run this and see what happens. Okay, now that that's all up and running, let's go ahead and check and make sure everything's kosher here. So let's do a kubectl create-f WordPress 2.yaml and let this thing create a bunch of resources, and we'll see what those do after they run. Okay, now that that's deployed, we should be able to run some commands to get some statuses on my MySQL server from Kubernetes. So we can do kubectl get MySQL server. That's that resource type that we had in our manifest file. And we should see a status about that because it has telemetry from the deployment that was going on by Azure Resource Monitor being reported back into Azure Kubernetes Services. So what this allows me to do is actually see stuff going on Azure within the context of Kubernetes. I could also use describe to get a detailed output of that as well. And here's the output of that is telling me it took me about 4 minutes to deploy that. Everything looks good. So if everything's going on, I should be able to go to the portal and see this. So let's pull this up in the portal and see what I had going on here. It looks like there it is. I already did a refresh on this page. And let's go see if we have a database in here. There is that logon name it generated for me. And let's see, I have the SSL disabled. That's what I said. And everything else looks pretty much the same as what I might expect for this. And so I should be able to use this database for my application. So let's go get my IP address and let's see if I can connect to it using those secrets. So let's take a look at those secrets first before we go doing that. So I should be able to do kubectl get secret, and there is the one I created for when I created the actual MySQL server using that Azure Service Operator. And I should be able to use a describe to get some details about the keys that it created for me. So let's do a describe on that guy. And if I could spell right. And there's the fully qualified server name, the username. There's the username and password, which is the parameters I put into my manifest file. So with that, I should be able to do a kubectl get service and get the IP address of my external IP address for my MySQL instance. And I'm sorry, my WordPress instance, not my MySQL instance. And I should be able to get pods to see how my WordPress is handling. It looks like there's an issue there. So let's debug that and we'll come back. Okay, now that I've figured out what's wrong with my pod, I should be able to do a get pods here and kubectl get pods. And that should show me that my WordPress pod is now up and running. It happened to be something with the configuration that I had inside of my manifest file that wasn't allowing the WordPress application to connect to the database. Once I resolved that, everything was up and running, and everything looks good now. And let's go get my service endpoint by using get service, and that'll give me my IP address. Now, if it did pick up that secret that was created and that username that was created whenever I ran this, I should not be prompted for any kind of database configuration inside of my deployment here for WordPress. So let's pick the language, and I should get the screen right here. So that means because I'm seeing the screen, I wasn't prompted for any kind of database credentials. I didn't put a username, password, database name, or the database host in my WordPress installation because it was able to pick those up from environment variables. So that means everything was working there. So we can type Blaze website, and I'm going to delete this really quickly. So even if I misspell something, who cares? And I'm going to give it a name, Blaze, and then we'll copy that. That's fine. And sure, have my email address because I'm going to nuke this anyway, and install. And this will install WordPress to that database, which, because I'm using a low tier, this is not exactly performant. So if I was going to be using a more production-oriented application, I probably wouldn't use something in the basic tier for MySQL. I'd probably use a general purpose tier and give it some more to get behind the queries that it runs. And this has also got some pretty low class storage on it too, so I'm not able to do a lot of high performance queries on this. But if you're wanting something more performant, there are certainly options available on Azure for MySQL that allow you to do much more highly scalable, much more quick options on all databases, really, not just MySQL. So let's paste in that password, and I should be able to log into the control panel, and this is going to be pulling stuff from the database. That all looks good. And then if I click on this link, it should take me to the home page, which looks like it's pretty zippy, even with the misspelled title there. So all in all, this was a very easy thing to set up and configure, although there was a lot of steps involved. Now, the takeaway that I would say from this is, though, that the kinds of things that you would want to use this for would be more DevOps type purposes where you have Kubernetes in the mix. It's still not as mature as I'd like it to be, but it's still a cool feature. If you're thinking about using Kubernetes, it will certainly give you a lot of value added benefits to Kubernetes in the event that it does mature a little bit more. But in any case, it's a really cool technology. I'm glad that the project team is working on it, and I'll definitely be keeping my eyes on it, and maybe even making some contributions to that as I see fit for whatever purposes I might deem that I might need it for. So I use Azure for a lot of things, so using that in addition to Kubernetes manifest files or Helm charts might be very beneficial to some future projects. So stay tuned for more episodes. Next week, we'll probably pick up back with our series where we're talking about service meshes. But this week, I wanted to take a break and talk about this simply because it's pretty cool. So stay safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask when you're outside, and stay away from people that don't have masks so you don't get COVID-19. So until next time, thanks for watching.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintellect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintellect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintellect on Twitter at WintellectNow or at Wintellect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintellect.com. Until next time, thank you.